Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about the Vietnam War. This is part one. Just to define what the Vietnam War is, because it does get a little complicated. It's something that spans many decades. But basically, the Vietnam War can be described as this period of increasing US involvement in this region, which includes Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, from about the 1950s through the 1970s. And we can debate a little bit more when it started and when it ended, but that's a good kind of rule of thumb. Our huge goal here is basically prevent the country of South Vietnam from being taken over by North Vietnam, which was communist, right? And why do we want to do this? Containment, right? This is the Cold War. That is our ultimate, it is our top foreign policy priority: contain communism. Do not let it spread. All right. We can also look at something called the domino theory as playing a really important role here. And this is this idea that if one country falls to communism, right, it makes all the countries around it more vulnerable and they might fall to communism as well, right? So we know China, of course, has fallen to communism, with the 1949 communist revolution. Korea is communist. North Korea, of course, South Korea almost became communist. And now we have North Vietnam being communist, and perhaps if all of Vietnam becomes communist, then Laos and Cambodia and Thailand, and then all these other countries, all the other dominoes might fall as well, right? So we have to prop up this one here to make sure all of these ones don't fall. We can also look at the Vietnam War as an example of a proxy war. So it's very similar to what happened in the Korean War, right? It's this proxy war between the superpowers. We're not directly fighting the Soviets, but we're kind of indirectly fighting them, right? Kind of again what happened in Korea. So we have South Vietnam, which is supported by the US, and then we have North Vietnam, which is supported by communist China and Soviet Union. All right. So a little bit of background here. This region of Indochina, which you can see right here, this is all the Indochina basically. Um, this was actually originally a French colony going back for many decades, but like many places in Asia, it was occupied by the Japanese during World War II. And after World War II, we have to figure out what to do with it, right? Like Korea, like many other places, France wants to try to maintain their colony, all right, but the people, the Vietnamese people there, they don't want to be a French colony anymore. So these Vietnamese nationalists are going to be fighting the French. They're going to be led by this guy named Ho Chi Minh, who wants to create an independent Vietnam. He doesn't want to be a colony anymore. Problem for him is that he's a communist, right? So immediately the US and all the other Western allies of the US are going to see him as a threat, right? And so the US is going to help France basically try to win this war. We give them billions of dollars in aid and supplies. But as we know, France isn't good at anything, and they were defeated, and they left in 1954. The peace agreement here in 1954 is going to divide Vietnam in half. Basically, at the 17th parallel, you can kind of see that right here, basically splitting the country in half, similar to what we did in Korea, because that worked out so well, right? So we're going to have a communist government in the north, and we're going to have a democratic government in South Vietnam. But I want to point out that the government in South Vietnam, the leader, not very popular, not very effective. In 1959, similar to what happened in Korea, North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam in an effort to create a united one Vietnam, right? And that's where the issue is. The US kind of fundamentally misunderstands this civil war between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. We see it as this communist takeover, as this expansion of communism, right? But it was really more just about creating a unified and independent country. for the Vietnamese people. It wasn't really about communism. Ho Chi Minh didn't really want to be aligned with the Chinese or the Russians. He just wanted a free and independent Vietnam for his people. All right. So what we see throughout the late 50s and into the early 1960s is the US is going to steadily increase their involvement here, right? Again, we are very concerned about South Vietnam getting taken over by communist North Vietnam. We see this as a threat, right? A communist takeover, and we must contain communism at all costs. President Kennedy is going to send about 16,000 military advisors to help South Vietnam in their civil war against the communist North Vietnamese. All right. And then things are really going to escalate in August of 1964 with the Tonkin Gulf incident. Supposedly, some American ships were attacked right here, kind of off the coast of North Vietnam by some North Vietnamese, right? We have Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara here kind of pointing out this on the map. And so we see this as an act of aggression. Now, reports and investigations later show that this was probably an accident and not a deliberate, act of aggression. But as you know, the US, we just need little tiny excuses to go to war, right? Congress is going to pass the Tonkin Gulf Resolution as a result of this incident, and it basically gave President Johnson a blank check to direct military operations. Basically, Congress is saying, hey, President Johnson, do whatever you need to do, spend whatever amount of money you need to spend to defeat communism in Vietnam. So there's no official declaration of war here. All right. Does anyone think this is a good idea to give the president this much power, right? But again, it's the Cold War, right? We have our Cold War glasses on. The threat of communism is all we can see. And so under orders from President Johnson, the US is going to start a very intense bombing campaign against North Vietnam. All right. As the war progresses, we see the US continually kind of up the ante here. We can really mark the beginning of the war here in March of 1965. This is when the very first ground troops, or what we call combat troops, were sent to Vietnam. Here's a picture actually of a group of Marines landing in Da Nang, Vietnam here in March of 1965, marking the first time we have combat troops on the ground. Their original mission was to protect the air bases that were carrying out those bombing attacks in North Vietnam. But very quickly, this devolved, and those combat troops began engaging in combat, right, with North Vietnamese forces and the so-called Viet Cong guerrillas, which was the Southern Vietnamese insurgent force. And the war basically continues to escalate from there. The US kind of took over more and more control of the war. This is known as the Americanization phase. You can see over time, more and more troops are being sent into Vietnam, right? At the peak of the war, 1968, 1969, there were over 500,000 American troops here in Vietnam. All right, that's just a huge number. And it basically became our war, right? And so what we see is the draft is going to be utilized more heavily to meet the demands for troops. And this really becomes one of the most controversial parts of the war. So some characteristics here of the war itself. It was very difficult terrain, very difficult climate. We have guerrilla style warfare. You can kind of see some of the photos here. I'll show you guys. We do see some new technologies here. The helicopter. This was one of the first times we see the helicopter heavily utilized in warfare. We do have this technological, this military advantage over Vietnamese, but we don't necessarily have this clear purpose, right? We also refer to Vietnam as sometimes as the living room war because of all the television coverage. It was the first war that was covered heavily, by television broadcasts, and people would get these nightly, nightly reports as to what was going on in the war. All right. The draft, right, is implemented, is seen as discriminatory because they had those college deferments. You could get out of the draft if you were in college. It left more poor people, more minorities to be drafted. And essentially, the war becomes this kind of war of attrition. We have this superior technology, we have more people, um, but the Vietnamese really just kind of have to wait till we leave, right? They just have to hang on. And what we see is government and military officials continually kind of mislead the public on the purpose of the war. And all of this adds up to increased opposition to the war on the part of the American people. So we're going to go ahead and pause there. This is Vietnam War Part 1.